Daniel chapter 4 is where we are beginning. I think I timed it better this time. We will find out together because it's just so much stuff. It is so full. Every single chapter is, it, like you can look at just my descriptions, my chapter summaries that I have listed on the page for you. And yes, the print is very small because there are so many things going on. And in order to kind of place any of it in your head, you're kind of in for a penny, in for a pound, as it were. But Daniel chapter 4 is a unique moment within the overall Bible because it is a Gentile king writing in a Gentile language who is massively declaring the praises of the God of Israel in his own hand. Now, we see other places where we see Gentile kings praising God. We see it with Cyrus at the end of 2 Chronicles, beginning of Ezra chapter 1. We'll see sort of a little bit later with King Darius as well, but none of those are anywhere near what we see here. And verse 1 tells us that this chapter is a letter. It's a proclamation from King Nebuchadnezzar to the people of the Babylonian Empire. In verse 1 and 3, Nebuchadnezzar begins with a declaration of praise for the Most High God. And verse 2 has the intent of this letter. That it seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. That is the heart of Nebuchadnezzar. And of all the things we know about Nebuchadnezzar, this seems to be the total antithesis of his personality, his pride, and quite honestly, just how conceited he was. But something's changed, and this chapter records that change. In verse 4 and 5, we see Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. This dream is unsettling to him. And why God keeps using dreams to reach Nebuchadnezzar, we cannot say. The Bible doesn't tell us. My personal theory is that Nebuchadnezzar was such a personality that the only time he would be quiet and would listen was when he was sleeping. But regardless, he has this dream. And he sends for the wise men, the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and diviners, just like he did in chapter 2. But this time, he tells them to dream. He didn't tell them the dream in chapter 2, but here he tells them to dream. But when they hear this dream, they're unable to explain the dream to him, even though he tells them the imagery and the things that he saw and the things that he heard. So far, at this point, the wise men of Babylon are 0 for 2. And the dream is so unsettling and it's so nebulous to them, they can't even make something up. That's how unsettling and overwhelming the dream was. In verse 8, Nebuchadnezzar tells us that Daniel came in. Note that Nebuchadnezzar uses both Daniel's Hebrew name and his Babylonian name when identifying him. Now, what this conveys to us is a couple of things. One is that Nebuchadnezzar is going to use Babylonian terms in his testimony to the Babylonian people. So this is a Babylonian decree by a Babylonian king to Babylonian subjects. Which is why later when we get to verse 13, 17, and 23, and we get to this term watcher being used for angels, we don't see that particular term anywhere else in the Bible. It only appears here in this one chapter because he's using terms that the Babylonian audience would understand. That's why he refers to Daniel both as Daniel, because he has this love relationship with Daniel. He's affectionate towards Daniel. But they won't know him by Daniel. They're going to know him by his Babylonian name. In verse 10 through 17, Nebuchadnezzar tells Daniel the dream. That he saw in his mind a tree, a huge tree, and he watched as the tree got bigger and bigger until the top reached high into the sky, where this tree could be seen from all over the earth. Many species of animals and birds were able to thrive by living in and around this tree. And everything seemed to be going great until verse 13, when an angel descended from heaven and he shouted out that the tree should be chopped down, its leaves were to be ripped away, and for its fruit to be scattered, to drive the birds and beasts away, but leave the stump, leave the roots, put a band of iron and bronze around it. Let the tree live like the animals in the field live. And whereas the tree once had a mind like a man, so we know it's not an actual tree, the tree is symbolic of something else. Or once the tree had a mind like a man, let him now have a mind like a beast. And this condition will last for 7 periods of time. Now, verse 17 tells us that this was the decree of the watchers. It was a command of the holy ones. Now, we're not exactly sure what that means, and Daniel's not led to explain it to us in verse 23. So what does it mean? Does this mean that there's a council of angels who are allowed to make decisions regarding human affairs while still being under the sovereign rule of God? We know from Job 1:8 that Satan watches us. 1 Peter chapter 1 tells us that angels long to peer into the revelations entrusted to us. But the Bible doesn't use this kind of imagery in this chapter about the watchers anywhere else. So we really don't know what it is that he's indicating. Perhaps for the Babylonian mind, the idea of deities watching you just made sense to them. They were pagan. They had lots of gods. So any kind of voice that they heard outside of your normal realm was deemed to be these spiritual watchers. But we know that God will send messages to mankind through angels, that they don't have any governance ability on their own per se. There's a lot of things in this we don't know, but what we do know for sure is that this dream messes with Daniel too. Not just Nebuchadnezzar, not just the wise men. Verse 19 tells us that Daniel was visibly upset by the dream. And it seems like he doesn't speak for a while. Nebuchadnezzar has to kind of prod and reassure Daniel. Daniel, say everything that's in your mind. Don't be afraid. Now, knowing what we know about Daniel, Daniel's likely not scared to tell Nebuchadnezzar the truth. He's a guy who'll tell you what he thinks. We'll see this in chapter 5 as well. Rather, Daniel seems to have this genuine affection for Nebuchadnezzar by this point. And he tells Nebuchadnezzar, you know what, I wish this dream was about your enemies and not you. But sadly, it's about you. You are the tree that grew strong. That's verse 22. The king is going to be chopped down, meaning he's going to be humbled. He's going to be driven away from the people and would dwell among the beasts of the field until 7 periods of time pass over him. Until Nebuchadnezzar realizes this truth, that the Most High is the ruler over the kingdoms of mankind, and he bestows the kingdom on whomever he desires. That statement is the theme of the entire book of Daniel. The sovereignty of God. That God is king over all. And we're going to see this phrase repeated in verse 17, 25, and 32. 17, 25, and 32. And why is it repeated 3 times? Because every matter shall be established by what? 2 or 3 witnesses. So we have 3 statements all saying the same thing. This tells us how important this concept is. And it tells us what the central sin of Nebuchadnezzar is, that it's pride. We'll see it in verse 30. Nebuchadnezzar thought he was the reason his kingdom was great. Until he learned that God alone was the reason for his empire, he would be humbled. He would live like an animal until he understood the truth. And how long would that lesson take? 7 periods of time. We don't know what that means. It doesn't help that we're still in the Aramaic portion of this book, so we don't have the rest of the Bible to kind of play off of in order to know what these periods of time were. Because later in Daniel 7:25, we have the same Aramaic word being used for time, times, and half a time. And because there it appears to refer to years, so that's half of the 7-year tribulation period, it's probably safest to assume that Nebuchadnezzar will be in this condition for 7 years. Which is why it's so important that verse 26, we're told that the stump is left with the roots. That this is the decision from heaven. Not only are we going to cut it down, we're going to protect the stump. We're going to protect the roots. That's not going to be ripped out. Now, after this is over, God is going to preserve and eventually restore the kingdom to Nebuchadnezzar at the end of this. And if it is for 7 years that Nebuchadnezzar is going to be in this condition, it would be impossible for any man to hold on to what Nebuchadnezzar had. 7 years would be too long to hide the fact that Nebuchadnezzar was in this condition. And in that time and in that place, you just didn't show weakness. To show weakness for almost a decade was to invite someone else to take your crown. But the central lesson is this. The Most High is the ruler over all the kingdoms of mankind. And you can't come and take this throne from Nebuchadnezzar unless the Lord says it's time. For he bestows the kingdom on whomever he desires. So when Nebuchadnezzar comes out of this, he will understand only God could have maintained his crowd. In verse 27, Daniel begs Nebuchadnezzar to repent. O king, live humbly, live righteously before the Lord. And in verse 29, it seems that Nebuchadnezzar was relatively good for about 12 months. But one day he's walking along the observation deck of the palace. And he thinks to himself, isn't this place great? Isn't this place amazing, this thing that I have built with my own hands, and I built so others would know how great I am? While the words are still in his mouth, verse 31, he heard a voice from heaven saying, the dream will come to pass. Now, verse 33 describes his condition, and the judgment is so profound that every part of his appearance is described like that of a bird or a beast. Now, we don't know if his body physically changed in order to take on these attributes. It might just be describing that his nails grew really long and his hair grew really long, but the way it's described, it's almost like his appearance became feral of some sort. But, and you got to love that word, at the end of that period, when Nebuchadnezzar's heart was humbled, verse 34 tells us that he raised his eyes toward heaven. The idea being that he was laid so low, he has to lift his eyes now to look toward God. And as soon as he does that, as soon as that action begins, God returns his mind back to him. And what is the first thing he does with his mind back to sanity? He blesses the Most High and praises and honors him who lives forever. Nebuchadnezzar confessed that the dominion of the Lord lasts forever, verse 34, but, verse 35, the people who dwell on this earth are nothing compared to the King of Kings. With this understanding firmly in Nebuchadnezzar's heart, God restores the kingdom to Nebuchadnezzar. And we have the final words of Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible in verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and all his ways are just. Chapter 5. In verse 1, we are introduced to the last king of Babylon before they were conquered by the Medo-Persians. Now, this is not the next king of Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is going to be called father here, but it's in kind of like the biblical application of father. So your kids and your grandkids and your great-grandkids all would call you father, right? So it means that they're all descendants of Nebuchadnezzar. The king who takes over after Nebuchadnezzar is his son, Evil-Merodach. We know him from 2 Kings 25:27. 2 Kings 25 is where we see Evil-Merodach. He takes over after Nebuchadnezzar passes away. But later, he is going to be murdered by his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law becomes king. When that guy dies, his son rules for 2 months before Nabonidus, who is the son of Nebuchadnezzar, possibly through like a consort or something like that. It's a little bit unclear. The family tree gets real muddled at this point. But Nabonidus takes the throne and returns it back to the family of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, you can see that sequence in the back of your History of Israel timeline that we had out there. It helps a lot. You can see how all the kings kind of fall in here. But what Nabonidus does, when he takes the throne, he has this incredible desire to restore the glory of the empire. So he spends most of his time in other areas, far away from Babylon, trying to conquer lands that they had lost after Nebuchadnezzar passed away, building temples that were broken down to sun gods and stuff like that. But someone needed to call the shots back in the capital. So what he did was he elevated his son Belshazzar to the throne. It's very common. We see it with the kings of Israel going all the way back to David, that when your time was getting short, you would take your son and make them kind of co-king with you, so that way you could guide them and there would be this smooth transition of power. It's the same kind of thing happening here. And Belshazzar, who is the co-regent, is who we see in verse 1. This is why later when Belshazzar offers up to 1/3 of the kingdom, the reason he does that is because that's all he can give. He can't give half the kingdom, because then there's no room for him. So that's kind of how the pie gets sliced. In verse 1, we have our first image of Belshazzar. He's holding a huge feast with 1,000 of his nobles. And what they're doing is they're trying to act brave in the face of death. The Medo-Persian Empire is coming. At this point, they have conquered almost all of the area of Babylon. All that's left is the actual capital city. They're bearing down on Babylon at this particular time. And as part of this drunken feast where they're all kind of showing a rambunctiousness in the face of fear, he orders that the gold vessels that Nebuchadnezzar removed from the temple in Jerusalem to be brought so they can drink wine out of them. And they were going to, while they're drinking wine out of them, drink toast to the pagan gods of Babylon. Now that rationale is very important. He didn't just want a fresh set of cups. He wasn't like, these are dirty, we need new cups. It was a specific, intentional act of pride and disrespect. That other gods were not strong enough to defeat Babylonian gods. Did we not conquer the gods of all these people? And the gods of the Persians are going to be exactly the same. So that's the idea with this drinking and this toasting. But the God of the Jews were not like the fake gods of the world. And in verse 5, while they're carrying this out, he makes himself known, and suddenly a disembodied hand begins writing on the wall. We're told that it's opposite a lampstand. The idea is that the lampstand is shining light on the wall, so everybody sees what's going on. It's not like it was in a dark corner and then someone turned around and said, hey, what's that over there? Everybody could see it. This was the hand of God writing on the wall. And you may want to write John 8:6 in the margin here, John 8:6, as a reminder of that time when God himself stooped down in the dirt and wrote on the ground. When Belshazzar saw the writing on the wall, this says he loses all his composure. Verse 6 tells us that he went weak, his knees began knocking together. In verse 7, Belshazzar summoned the wise men. He promised riches, promotion to anyone who could read and interpret the message. But of course, the wise men could not read the inscription or make the interpretation known. Now, it's important that both elements are listed here, because the words were written in Aramaic. These are Aramaic words we're going to see in a minute. So even if they couldn't give the meaning of the words, they should have been able to at least read the words, but they couldn't. Which tells us that God hid even the words from their minds. They weren't given understanding to even read what was on the wall. And now the wise men are 0 for 3. When Belshazzar learned that they couldn't do anything, he became even more scared than he already was. The fact that he doesn't get angry tells us how inept and weak of a leader he really was. Now, word of this situation eventually reaches the queen. This is likely the queen mother. She's the gap in the knowledge and the tradition going back to Nebuchadnezzar down to Belshazzar here. She encourages Belshazzar to send for Daniel. And this tells us a couple of things. One, Daniel wasn't at the party. He wasn't like, well, this is a new guy and I got to get on his good graces, so I need to go to the party just like everyone else. Even to this point, Daniel's just faithful. Number 2, the description of Daniel is glowing. The way that she describes him, it's hard to believe that Belshazzar didn't know him. Number 3, the queen had complete confidence in Daniel. Look at the end of verse 12. She says, summon Daniel, and he will tell you what this means. In verse 13, Daniel was brought before Belshazzar. And in verse 16, Belshazzar makes the offer of reward and promotion if Daniel can do what he asks. And what's Daniel's response? Keep your stuff. Give your gifts to someone else. The offer almost seems to offend Daniel, which makes sense, because Belshazzar doesn't understand the most basic thing about Daniel. And the entire life of Daniel declares this message: some things are not for sale. We saw this in chapter 1. When the Babylonians tried to win over Daniel and his friends with food and drink. But Daniel understood from a young age that there are some things you can never lose, because if you lose them, it changes who you are. That being said, Daniel will give the interpretation to Belshazzar because he understands the Most High God wants to say something to you. In verse 18 through 21, Daniel reminds Belshazzar what we just studied in chapter 4, about how God humbled Nebuchadnezzar. And so Nebuchadnezzar recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he sets over it whomever he desires. Yet when you became king, Belshazzar, you were puffed up with pride, even though you knew the story well. That's verse 22. Instead of being humbled, you have insulted the Lord of heaven by giving drunken toast to the pagan gods of Babylon. So the one true king sends this message to the king. Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. Those are the words, and this is the message. Mene is an Aramaic word that means to weigh something out, trying to get to a specific weight, somewhere around 50 to 60 shekels. So you're weighing this out, trying to get to a particular limit. Now, this is mentioned twice, because God is measuring twice, and he's only going to cut once. Tekel also means to weigh. So there's this contrast between the two. The one says he keeps trying to weigh and see if you'll get up to this point. And he's done it once, and he's done it twice, and both times have come up with the same result. I've weighed you out, but you haven't reached the standard. And when he didn't measure up the first time and didn't measure up the second time, now, Upharsin, the kingdom has been broken. It's going to be cut off, and you're being given over to the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, in response to this interpretation, Belshazzar rewards Daniel as he promised. It shows he did not understand what God was trying to say. That night, Babylon would fall. Belshazzar would be slain. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom of Babylon on October the 12th, 539 BC. October the 12th, 539 BC. Darius the Mede was age 62. Now, at this time, Cyrus the Persian was king over the entire Medo-Persian Empire. So, who's Darius? Darius was either a regional name for Cyrus, so kind of like if we refer to the president as the commander-in-chief or as POTUS. Those are terms for the same guy. Or Cyrus was over the entire empire. He was the Persian. But then Darius the Mede was placed over Babylon, the nation of Babylon, the empire of Babylon, the region of Babylon, and the city as well. Now, both are possible. We don't truly know. But when we get to Daniel 6:28, it kind of leans toward these being two different individuals. Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is our last historical chapter in the book of Daniel. And so Daniel is kind of broken up into two sections. The first 6 chapters are historical. The second 6 chapters are prophetic. This section of Daniel, this historical section of Daniel, closes with one of the most famous stories in the Bible, Daniel in the lion's den. Now, in verse 1 through 3, we see that when Darius took over the Babylonian Empire, he signed 120 officers to run the kingdom. And over these 120 officers, he placed 3 guys to act as commissioners. Daniel was one of these 3. And he so excelled in his position that Darius intended to make Daniel over everyone. So this is similar to what we see happen with Joseph in Genesis 41, where Pharaoh makes him second in charge of the entire kingdom. Only in terms of the throne will I be greater than you, Joseph. It's the same kind of dynamic here. Daniel would have been second in command. Only in the matter of the throne would Darius be greater than him. This intended promotion of Daniel caused jealousy among the 120 satraps and the 2 other commissioners. So they start looking for some kind of corruption, some kind of negligence, some kind of chink in the armor that they could use to sully Daniel's image before the king, but they couldn't find anything. In everything, Daniel was faithful, and in everything, Daniel was wise. In verse 5, they come to the conclusion that their only chance of being able to accuse him of anything is to find some way to twist his faithfulness to his God against him. For the Bible student, please note that this is the same thing we see in Matthew 26, verses 63 through 66. Matthew 26, verses 63 through 66. What is the charge that Jesus is actually crucified for? He is crucified for being found guilty of being the Son of God. Here with Daniel, this is the highest compliment that we could ever receive. And they unwittingly applied it against Daniel to say, the only thing I can find wrong with you is your faithfulness to your Lord. In verse 6, we see this group of 122 officials use flattery to set a trap for King Darius. Now, this is a Proverbs 29:5 moment. Proverbs 29:5. That the man who flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his steps. They convinced the king to create a law for 30 days that no one can make any petition for help or blessing. Nobody can seek anyone's favor except to seek it from the king for those 30 days. The idea is that King Darius is such a good king. He's the best. He's the kindest. Therefore, there's no reason to seek blessings from anyone else. If anyone wants something good, they should only come to you, O king. This is a completely pointless law. There is no reason for it at all. But once he signs it into effect, verse 8, it becomes a law that cannot be changed, not even by the king. Now, the officials know exactly what they're doing. And in verse 15, they're going to use this rigidity of the law to close the trap so that not even Darius could rescue Daniel from his fate. In verse 9, Darius signs the petition into law. And as soon as Daniel hears it, so he knows what's going on, he hears that the law is signed, he goes straight to his house and opens the window of his house that faced toward Jerusalem. He kneels down and he begins to pray. Please understand that Daniel is not flaunting his piety in the face of the law. Verse 10 tells us that this was his practice. This is how Daniel prayed. And yes, he could have closed the windows. He could have hid inside. But the character of Daniel leads us to believe that to do something like that would have violated his personal conscience. He's not telling you that you have to pray in the window. But for him to do anything less, he would have called that sin. And as we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23 through 33, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23 through 33, if something convicts you, then to you that something is sin. For Daniel, hiding inside was not an option. We can safely assume he understood the purpose of the law. He knew what was going on. I mean, how many times has Daniel been praised for his understanding, his wisdom? That understanding makes it all the more important that he not compromise not even a little bit here. Because he likely knew he was being watched. They were going to see if he would hide the fact that he followed the Lord the way that he did. And in Daniel's mind, and undoubtedly it's true, that if he would have ran inside the house and hid behind closed windows, then that would have reflected negatively on his trust in our God. So he opens his windows and he prays to the Lord. Now, that's exactly what the wicked officials were looking for. They were hoping this would happen. And as soon as they see it, they run to the king and they let him know, Daniel violated your law. And as soon as the king hears this, verse 14, he knew he had been tricked. Verse 14 tells us Darius was deeply upset by this turn of events. He seems to have had this tremendous heart for Daniel, not just because he was a good worker and I'm going to promote you, but he seems to have this real affection for this guy. And we're told that he keeps searching till the very last second of the day to find some way to save Daniel from the den. But the laws and the Medo-Persians cannot be changed. Now, this rigidity was meant to make the king thoughtful about the laws that he passed. Don't make rash laws, king, because once you do, they can't be changed. But wicked officials use flattery, the foolishness of the king, and the rigidity of the law to trap Daniel. In the end, Darius has no choice. He gives the order. Daniel is thrown into the den. And what he likely thought were his closing words to Daniel, he said, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. In verse 18, we see that the king had a rough night. He couldn't sleep. He was too upset to eat. And at the earliest moment of the day, verse 19, at the very beginning of the dawn, he ran to the lion's den. He had the stone removed from the mouth of the den, and he cried out, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you. From inside the den, Darius heard what may be the most beautiful sound he's heard in a while. He heard the voice of Daniel saying, "O king, live forever." What a respectful, humble way to begin. Of all the things he could have said to the king, he didn't. Instead, it's this greeting of respect. Daniel then tells King Darius that our mighty God sent an angel who shut the mouths of the lion. For the Lord found Daniel innocent of any crime. Darius was overjoyed that Daniel was safe. He ordered that Daniel be brought up. Remember, the law demanded that Daniel be cast into the lion's den. Nothing said he had to stay down there. So he fulfilled the law. He went in. Now he's coming back out. Daniel comes up, and the wicked men go down. And not just them, but their kids and their wives, which tell us how upset Darius was about this. At the end of verse 24, we see that the lions demolished their bodies before they even hit the ground. This confirms that if God did not intervene and prevent the lions from hurting Daniel, Daniel would have been undone. But just like God was with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in the fiery furnace, he was with Daniel here. And this fact is not lost on Darius. At the end of this chapter, he issues a new law, that all the people of his kingdom are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For his kingdom is everlasting. In Hebrews 7:25, our God is able to save. Chapter 7. As we mentioned at the beginning of chapter 6, right? The first 6 chapters are historical, the last 6 are prophetic. And what we will see here in chapter 7 is a return to the theme of the dream given Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. Now, this is going to be our last chapter in Aramaic. We have a transitioning building here to the next one. We're going to look at overall kingdoms before we start to narrow down on just a couple of kingdoms and really one guy in particular. Now, this dream here given to Daniel is related to the dream given to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2. So these two ideas, dreams dealing with these coming world empires, are the bookends for the Aramaic section. So this goes to the dream. This dream that comes to Daniel in the first year of Belshazzar. So this is 553 BC. If you want to be a nerd and write it in there, 553 BC is when this dream comes to Daniel. In this dream, Daniel saw 4 great beasts coming out of the sea. Just like before, there's 4 major kingdoms and then this caveat kingdom, this transition kingdom, this appendix kingdom, however you want to view it in your head. Now, when we see this term about this great sea, it's a reference to the Mediterranean Sea. But when we look at the image of a sea in prophetic sections, it's also a picture of the people of the world. So we will see this in Isaiah 17:12, and Revelation 17:15. Revelation 17:15. These 4 beasts will match the 4 main nations that we saw in Nebuchadnezzar's statue dream. So verse 4 is Babylon. Verse 5 is the Medo-Persian Empire. Verse 6 is the Greek Empire. And then verse 7, we have this 4th beast. Now, this beast, and especially the little horn that pops up, it really, really bothers Daniel. Now, we know from the statue dream that this 4th beast corresponds to the Roman Empire. But that Roman Empire then blends into this iron and clay empire that comes after it. We have the same kind of thing happening here. This 4th beast has 10 horns, which per Daniel 7:24 and Revelation 17:12, Revelation 17:12, these 10 horns represent 10 kings who will pop up in the last days. Now, the idea of horns is both power and authority. That's why there's horns on the altar, represents the power and the authority of God. What we're going to learn in Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation chapter 17, verse 9 through 13, Revelation 17, 9 through 13, is that the 10 kings will be raised up and given authority for one purpose: to hand that authority over to the Antichrist, to the beast. I mean, is what Revelation 17 tells us. And Daniel 7 tells us that the 10 kings are already there when this little horn pops up. There's 10 horns, and then this little horn pops up. And then it's going to tear out 3 of the kings. It then becomes the 8th horn, which is why in Revelation 17, there's only 7 kings plus the Antichrist left. because he's already torn out the 3 horns, and he's going to replace those 3 with himself. So now there's going to be 8 horns representing this brand new kingdom that he is bringing about. Now, one more thing about this little horn. The defining thing about this little horn is verse 8. This little horn had a big mouth, uttering great boasts. That is the defining characteristic of the little horn. It's boastful. It's proud. As Daniel kept looking, a series of thrones are set up. Now, we're only told about one person who actually sits on the throne, because he's the only one that matters. But the reason we know about the other thrones is because the one who matters is over these other thrones. That's their importance. That's why they're represented here. We saw this in Daniel chapter 4, right? The Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind. He bestows it on whom he desires. In verse 9, Daniel tells us as he watches the Ancient of Days take his seat. He's the only one we see sit down. And it's a wonderful way to describe our Lord. The idea is that our Lord was already ancient before time began. This is something we discussed when we studied Micah 5:2. Micah 5:2, that our God exists from eternity past, from beyond the vanishing point. The idea is that you can look back as far as you possibly can until time disappears over the horizon. And in that space, beyond the horizon that you can actually see, God was already there. A fun detail to note, verse 9 mentions wheels and fire along with this imagery of the throne of God. This is what we saw in Ezekiel. So the images are the same. In verse 10, the court sits when the Lord sits. Now, some think, again, this idea of watchers kind of messes with us a bit. Some think this refers to this court of angels who will judge the Antichrist, or this council of angels that counsel the Lord, even though other places tell us, who is counsel of the Lord? More likely, this is just Anthony's guess. But I wonder if it's a reference to what we see in Revelation 4, verses 2 through 4. Revelation 4, verses 2 through 4. That the Lord sits on this beautiful throne, and around that throne are 24 thrones, on which sit 24 elders, who fall down and worship the King. And perhaps that's what's being represented here. I mean, either way, it's probably best to think about this as a court is in session kind of thing. The judge has come into his courtroom. He sits down upon his throne, and as soon as he sits on the throne, what happens? The court is now in session. As the court of the Lord begins, the little horn keeps talking and talking right up until the end. Right up until the 4th beast, the Roman system that leads into the Antichrist system is slain. It's like he doesn't know when to stop. And I've been in courtrooms like this. I've been in there when the defendant just would not keep his big mouth shut, and he's saying things on the stand. I'm looking at his attorney. I'm like, do you hear what he's saying? You got to get him to stop. But he can't stop. Why? Because he's boastful. He's proud. He's certain he can get away with it. I can just talk my way out of it. I can bluster and bluster but until everything is gone. As he is slain, verse 13, we see one like the Son of Man coming. We know that this is the Messiah because when the Jewish people receive this text, even to this day, this is the Messiah. This is the one who's returning to come and restore Israel to where it should be. The Messiah, our Lord, stands before God the Father, and then we see the fulfillment of Psalm 110, verse 1. Psalm 110, verse 1, as the Lord gives to our Lord dominion, glory, and a kingdom, one that will never pass away. Now, this is all just way too much for Daniel. In verse 16, he goes to one of the multitude in verse 10, and he goes, okay, you got to explain to me what's going on. And that guy is going to explain to him everything that we just talked about now. Chapter 8. Two years after the dream in chapter 7, so 2 years have passed, God gives Daniel another vision. Now, we are back in the Hebrew section. That Aramaic section ended at the end of the last chapter. Now we start this new one. And we went from the 4 kingdoms, 4 empire vision, if you will. Now we're just shrinking down to 2. And it's the 2 that are coming next. Now here God gives Daniel another vision. This time it focuses on the second or third beast, second and third kingdoms. And in verse 2, Daniel is in the province of Elam, which is in southeast Babylon along the northern shore of the Persian Gulf. If you think about a map in your head and you see Saudi Arabia, it's off to the right. In verse 3, he sees a ram. And later in verse 20, when the angel Gabriel starts talking, he's going to tell us this ram represents the Medes and the Persians. In verse 4, we see that this ram was unstoppable. But, verse 5, suddenly we see this male goat come running from the west. This is the famed he-goat of the west, a goat that is running so fast that his feet don't even touch the ground. Verse 21 tells us that this is the kingdom of Greece under Alexander the Great. It's first king, and the idea is the first king that matters, the first one who united everything and actually started to push out. And as powerful as the Medo-Persian Empire was, it was powerless to stop the Grecian wave. But pride is always the issue. And in verse 8, this male goat with one large horn, that horn would be broken. And in place of this one large horn grew up 4 smaller horns. Historically, Alexander the Great died at a very young age, 32 in 323 BC. He was 32 in 323 BC. He died from something like malaria or pneumonia exacerbated by alcoholism. But he didn't have any heirs. That's the bigger thing. And it is asserted that as he was on his deathbed and he was asked who should receive the empire, he famously responded, to the strongest. So this began a power struggle among his generals. And 4 of his generals all vied for the kingdom, with 2 of them more or less coming out on top. The 2 that come out on top is Seleucus in the north around Syria and Ptolemy I in the south around Egypt. And between the 2 of these is Israel. Israel technically falling underneath the Seleucid Empire to the north, but because that was the central ground between them and Egypt, it became the all-purpose battleground and the fighting ground between the 2. Now, we will see much more regarding these 2 in chapter 11, but we need to understand what's going on here. Because in verse 9, a little horn pops up. And we already talked about a little horn, so we have basis to kind of understand what's going on. And this rather small horn is the reason why there's going to be this strong emphasis on the Greek kingdom and this one ruler throughout much of the rest of the book of Daniel. And that is because of the tremendous effect and persecution that this one person will have upon Israel. That's the beautiful land mentioned in verse 9. Pride was the core of this terrible sin. Of this little horn's terrible sin is pride. It's always pride. And even after this little horn attacks Israel in verse 10, it considers itself to be equal to God in verse 11. This little horn disrupts the daily sacrifices in Jerusalem and will actively persecute Israel for just over 6 years. Now, when we see years here, we're assuming, because at this time, years are based on a 360-day lunar-based calendar, not our 365 solar-based calendar. So when we look at the years in the prophecies, we are assuming a 360-day year. That helps in computations that come later. In verse 15, Daniel was struggling to understand what the vision meant. And in verse 16, we hear a voice call to Gabriel the angel, commanding him to make known to Daniel an understanding of the dream. This is our first formal introduction to Gabriel. Gabriel only appears in the book of Daniel, or by name, only appears in the book of Daniel and the Gospel of Luke. Only those 2. And he's only mentioned by name, speaking to 3 individuals: Daniel, Zacharias, who's the father of John the Baptist, and Mary, the mother of Jesus in the incarnation. Additional note: Gabriel is only one of 3 angels who are named in the canonical Bible: Michael, Gabriel, and Lucifer. Michael is called an archangel in Jude verse 9. Lucifer is called the anointed cherub who covers in Ezekiel 28. So both of those have very high rank. They're considered to be the equal of each other in rank and power. We are not told where Gabriel fits in to the hierarchy of angels. He's sometimes referred to as an archangel, which maybe is an application of the unnamed archangel in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, But that's speculation. The Bible doesn't say that. What we do see is that Gabriel is often dispatched to deliver incredibly important messages. Here he is to give Daniel an understanding of this dream. And the reason why this is so important is because while this is all ancient history to us, it is still future to the Jews. And when they saw the Persian Empire fall to the Greeks, and they see the rise of Antiochus IV, who would persecute and defile the temple of God with pig's blood, who would place a statue of Zeus inside of that place, the Jewish people would begin to worry. We've seen this already. We know how this ends up. And they needed to know God saw this coming. And even though the days of persecution would be fierce, they would be numbered. Specifically, 2,300 days. Now, note that in verse 17, there is a reference to the time of the end. What we will see in our study of this chapter is that this little horn, who will be Antiochus IV, will be a type, will be a picture of the Antichrist. When he is on the scene, it is not the last days yet. The last days don't begin until after Jesus goes up into the clouds. And there are going to be things that Antiochus IV will do in his life that will be a foreshadowing of what the Antichrist will do in the last days of the last days, particularly the abomination of desolation that Jesus will mention in Matthew 24:15. Matthew 24:15. And we will see that event mentioned 3 times in the book of Daniel because of its importance. In chapter 9, chapter 11, and chapter 12. In verse 20 here, and still inside of chapter 8, Gabriel explains that the ram represents the Medo-Persian Empire, that the goat represented Greece, and the first real king of Greece who seemingly conquered the world. In verse 22, his kingdom fragmented into 4 kingdoms, and out of that, the 4 kings and the 4 kingdoms would be this one insolent king. Now, we know this person as Antiochus IV. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes. That should be on your handout. Epiphanes is a fun Greek word for epiphany. Think about it like that. The idea is of the revealed one, the illuminated one, showing what he thought of himself. Antiochus IV will oppress and persecute the people of God, but the reason why is found in verse 25. Because he magnified himself. This is why he went after the people of God. Because those people don't worship me. Those people don't do what I tell them to do. He will even oppose the prince of princes. But this petty, cruel man will be broken without human agency. He's not defeated by another kingdom. Instead, he's going to die of some kind of illness. And some sources claim that he died of this painful disease in his bowels. And if 1 Maccabees is accurate history for us, it tells us that as he grew closer to his deathbed, he knew that it was a judgment by the God of the Jews because of the things he did in Jerusalem. In verse 26, Gabriel tells Daniel that he was to keep this vision and the understanding a secret for now. Even with this explanation, Daniel was still overwhelmed. But Daniel is always faithful. And for the next 13 years, he will ponder this vision alone, with no one else to talk to about it until we get to chapter 9. So, Father, we love you. Lord, so much, so much.